and we can work. We can be men without working, as well as also without laboring. But she is going to say on 176, the second page of this chapter, that without acting and speaking, we can't be men. Now, this is not a statement about the human nature, right? It's a statement, again, about the condition of being human as it's emerged in the Western tradition, or in the tradition, not even the Western tradition, but in the tradition of humanity over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. And what she wants to say is that without speech and action, men are literally dead to the world. We don't live in the world, in the condition of humanity that has been created and emerged, without speaking and acting. Action is for her a kind of second birth, a birth into the human world. And so there is a kind of priority, an important priority of action. That doesn't mean that action is the most important, because without work, without art, as we described the last couple of weeks, it would not be possible for action to be remembered and thus to create truly human lives. You need art and work. You need labor in addition to action. But in order to be fully human, she says, the one thing that each human needs is to act and speak. So, but having put that out there as an overarching rubric, let's look at the chapter 5 on action. She starts it with two epigraphs by Isaac Dinesen and Andante. The first is about the power of storytelling, and the second is about the idea of self-disclosure, of who one is as opposed to what one is. And these two ideas, stories and who I am, are going to, in a sense, frame and dominate this whole chapter on action. In short, I only am a person, become a person in the human world insofar as stories are told about me. And I only have stories told about me insofar as I act, insert myself into the world. And so in order to be a public person, to engage and become human, I have to risk acting and then have stories told about me. And we will pursue both of these as we go forth. I want to start section 24, which is really lays out some very important and fascinating concepts. Let's look at the first sentence on page 175, where Arendt writes, human plurality, the basic condition of both action and speech, has the twofold character of equality and distinction. Human plurality, not diversity, not difference. What is plurality? Well, on the one hand, plurality is the condition of politics. And on the other hand, she says it is the condition of action and speech. Why? Well, because if we're all the same, equal, we wouldn't be able to speak. We wouldn't need to speak to others. And action would not be something we would ever have to do. We would all just be the same. So plurality is the condition for acting and speaking, and thus for politics. But the second part of the sentence is the one I really want to focus on. Human plurality has the twofold distinction of equality and distinction. Twofold character of equality and distinction. On the one hand, you can't have plurality without equality. You can't have plurality without us all being equal. Because I couldn't speak to you, I couldn't be aware, you and I are aware, unless we had something that holds us together, that unites us. But the more important side is that plurality depends upon distinction. And distinction, she then separates into three categories. On the one hand is otherness, which is the stone is other from that stone, and the tree is other from that tree, the alteritas of objects. Then there's the distinction of organic living creatures, like this plant is different from that plant, or this plant is different from the human being. But the most important part of distinction that she wants to talk about is what she calls uniqueness. Uniqueness is what separates one human being from another. Speech and action, she says in the first paragraph on 176, or the first full paragraph, speech and action reveal this unique distinction. Through them, men distinguish themselves instead of being merely distinct. What is uniqueness? It is that special thing that separates and distinguishes a human being from another human being. It's what makes us unique. What is it? Well, it's what is our essence, what grows up from us and separates each one of us. It's our experiences, our hereditary, our family, and it comes out of the private, right? And we've talked a lot about the importance of the private for Arendt over and over again. It's in the private realm where we see things ourselves, not the way everybody in society sees them, not the way we see them through equality, but in our sort of crazy, individualistic, unique perspective. And human plurality has the character of both equality and distinctness. And it's this uniqueness, this unique distinctness, that action and speech reveal in the world. At the bottom of page 176, where she talks about how without action and speech, we are literally dead to the world. She says at the very bottom, with word and deed, we insert ourselves into the human world, and this insertion is like a second birth. We are all born biologically, and we will all die. But we are not human for Arendt. Again, not a natural sense, but in a conditional sense, until we insert ourselves into the human world with speech and action, word and deed. She then describes speech and action in the next few paragraphs. To act is to initiate. It's to be free. It's to do something that begins a process that's not, and thus is free. And by free, what she means here, and you can see it on 178, is that it cannot be expected. This is the very top of 178. This character of startling unexpectedness is inherent in all beginnings and in all origins. Thus, the origin of life from inorganic matter is an infinite improbability. The new, she says a few lines down, always happens against the overwhelming odds of statistical laws and their probability, which for all practical everyday purposes amounts to certainty. The new, therefore, always appears in the guise of a miracle. This is unique to Arendt. It's fantastically interesting. You cannot have politics without miracles, right? The miraculous is part of the human world. Often people today think miracles are what, we got over when we left religion and went into reason. From Arendt's point of view, that's exactly wrong. All real politics is miraculous. And she repeats this at length in her essay on what is freedom. What that means is that this is one reason that Arendt, despite sometimes seeming quite pessimistic, is always an optimist, because her basic view is that no matter how improbable change is, no matter how improbable transformation, for good or bad, is, the world will always change. The worst totalitarianism will end. The greatest republic will end. something new will always emerge as long as there are human beings. And this is the source of so much of her thinking, that in the end, anyone who says, oh, technology is destroying the world, or technology will turn us into robots, or the singularity is near, or capitalism is ruining things. Anyone who makes these kind of statements that this is over or this is the new way, for her, misunderstands action and politics and humanity, because within humanity is always the possibility of the miraculous and the new. In order to act and start something new, you have to act in a way that people will pay attention, right? If you just go to work every day and don't have a family and come home and live alone and never go out, you're generally going to be one of those invisible people. Now, maybe no one's fully invisible, and I don't want to, we can get into that, but invisibility of the poor, for Arendt, is the greatest danger to politics. The invisibility of those who don't act in such a way that others take notice of them is the great danger to their humanity and to politics. And so, in order to act and have people tell a story about you, you have to be courageous. You have to leave your private security and enter into a risky public world where people might tell good stories about you, tell bad stories about you, or they may kill you. And or they may make you king so that you have no time to play chess with your son. All of these things are risky. So I'm going to stop there because this is the longest and most important section here of the sections we're reading today. And I'm going to break it up into two and give you guys a chance to ask any questions you might have now, if there are any. And again, I apologize for the technical difficulties earlier.
Can I ask a question? Can you hear me?
Hello?
Yes, I can. I don't know who's speaking, but go ahead.
It's Kathleen. I'll go ahead if that's okay.
Yeah.
Just a question about the consequence of being dead to the world. In On Revolution, Arendt talks about how she won't really talk about slavery in the context of the American Revolution because, I don't remember the exact passage, but the explanation is essentially that slaves were socially dead or weren't kind of included in the social compact. And so she says something like slavery turns out to be an obscurity even blacker than poverty or something in comparison to the French Revolution.
That's right.
So just wondering, like, in a situation like that where you have people that, according to her own definition, would be dead to the world, kind of what is the consequence of that for something like the American Revolution, which she valorizes? So how do you, what happens to those people who are excluded?
It's a good question, Kathleen. Slavery in general for her is the ultimate human death, right? Let's start there. Obscurity is the ultimate human death. And so to start with origins of totalitarianism, which you mentioned, if you look at this chapter on chapter 9 of the book on human rights, what she says is that the only truly human right is not life or food, but the right to act and speak in public. It's to act. It's to be visible. And so from her point of view, the only way you truly destroy someone's human rights is to so fully enslave them that they are invisible. Now, of course, even slaves are visible to the extent they can revolt. She talks about putting people in holes of oblivion, And that's what she in the end calls concentration camps, right? The great innovation, and I'm using that obviously in a somewhat provocative way, of the concentration camp is that for her, that was the first time that we created a kind of slavery in which you couldn't even, if you revolted, no one would even know about it. You were dead to the world. And she revises that view in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, where written 8 years after Origins of Totalitarianism, in which now stories of people who did resist in the Holocaust and in the concentration camps have come out. And she has this beautiful line. It's probably my favorite line in all of Arendt, right? The holes of oblivion do not exist. There is no place you can be where you're fully enslaved from her point of view, in the sense that even in a black hole, you can do something that someone will eventually learn about and could be turned into a story, and your life can become meaningful. And so now to turn to your question about the American Revolution, what she says about slavery in On Revolution and also in her essay on Little Rock is that American slavery was different from other slaveries because it was so it made people so invisible, right? And as a result, she says, both in On Revolution and in the Little Rock essay, that slavery was the great crime of America, and that you can't understand America and American racial issues without understanding slavery as its original crime. That said, she valorizes the American Revolution, right? Because and I don't want to get too far into this, because the founders in her mind were able to create a political system and a constitutional political republic based on the idea that everyone in America had the potential to act and speak in public. She said one of the reasons they could do this was that there was no real poverty amongst free people. There was poverty, but it wasn't the kind of poverty that you had in Europe where people were so poor they couldn't be visible. And because slavery was so dark that they just ignored it. And so it's a fine line. She, on the one hand, says it was the great crime. On the other hand, it was such a terrible crime that the people were so ignored that they could actually be ignored in a way that actually helped America create a political system that allowed for public city, that would create an idea of America that could eventually let blacks free themselves from slavery and enter a free country. We can get into the discussion of On Revolution, which is important and fascinating, but that's how she understands it. You want to follow up, or does that answer your question?
No, that's really interesting. Thanks a lot.
Okay. I saw there was one other question. Does someone want to ask a question, or should I move on?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, my name's John Ennis, and when you said just before that anybody that would say that Arendt is anti-capitalism or that they're missing the point, first of all, thank you for this symposium, because this book is blowing my mind. The interconnectedness of thinking, the tightness of the fabric is amazing, and that's why sometimes it's hard to formulate a question, especially when we take it piece by piece. But last week when we were talking about art, from the family and the private sphere to the semi-public guilds to the market economy, I think what we were talking about was Marx's take on history on an economic level. And I think that Arendt is buying into that, and that's what she was describing there. So then we had a discussion about art and value of art and auction houses and art investment. And it seems to me that if we think of laborers in the mechanistic sense of Marx and how Arendt describes the mechanization, the machination of industry and the mix of the human, so that the human becomes a cog in the mechanistic wheel, the rhythm, and if we think about true value as espoused art, um, versus an arbitrary monetary value, which we place over art and usurp its actual value. And we do it to people as well, including artists. Don't the artists become like those laborers in the rhythm of creating like an Andy Warhol? I'm thinking Benjamin's Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So I keep waiting for her to close the argument and say, capitalism is killing us, and this light that she apparently sees, the hope that you're referring to. I see it emanating, and I think you disagree with me. You may not, in an emanation like Occupy. It may not be, it may have been a nascent emanation, but there is something I think that is going to take place in this country, and maybe in the world, because there's a lot of people that are invisible. And I don't know if maybe I'm missing something, or if any of these insights that I'm trying to glean from all of this are on point. I don't know if you can help me with that.
Okay. Let me. It's a big question, and I'm not sure I can do all of it justice in one answer, but let me try, John. So, Arendt is clearly worried about some elements of what you're calling capitalism. Primarily, what she worries about is what she calls consumerism, which we talked about when we discussed the labor chapter, in which we simply work to live and live to work and to consume, but without any higher aims or higher values. Her worry about automation is that in an age in which we no longer have religion or politics, in which we pursue the meaning of life and make life meaningful and thus strive to do great things, what is it that makes our lives meaningful today? Increasingly, when we enter the public sphere, we don't enter as political actors, we enter as laborers, as workers. When the first thing you ask about someone to place them is, what do you do? What's your job? And so what she says is, our job, our work has become what gives us meaning. And as our jobs become automated and cog-like, they become less meaningful, and thus we become less meaningful. But that's not, from her point of view, a capitalist problem, right? That's a problem about automation. Well, first, the problem of the loss of meaning outside of labor. And second, the demeaning of labor through automation. Neither of those are for her tied to capitalism necessarily. I mean, of course, there's connections to it. From a capitalist point of view, again, it depends what capitalist means for you. But we also talked a lot about how she makes a distinction between property and wealth. And for her, private property is absolutely essential in order for people to have a sanctuary, a place of their own, where they can become private individuals who have protection against both the government and society. The danger of capitalism, if you want to put it this way, is not private property. It's the transformation of private property into wealth, at which we don't actually own a home. We own an asset, and the asset is something we can sell or not, and thus we seek to acquire as much assets as we can, but without ever building a world or a private life and protection against society or the state. But private property, which some people think of as part and parcel of capitalism, is for her deeply important in the world. There may be other ways to achieve what private property achieves, but few of them have succeeded. So again, I mean, she's not a capitalist booster. She's not out there rah capitalism. But she is. She doesn't see capitalism to be the problem. Which is not to say that all, again, capitalism is all perfect. Another aspect of labor that she finds important is that labor keeps us always needing in some way to work to earn money, which prevents us from, in a sense, being static. And so there's an importance to humanity in laboring too. So I put that out there. Yeah, I'll leave it at that if that's okay, and we can come back to it. Let me move on to the second part of chapter 24, which begins on 178, where Arendt says that action and speech are related to the question, who are you? So this is, once we know that it's in action that we do something spontaneous and unexpected and new, once we know that it's in action that we, in a sense, make ourselves visible to others, insert ourselves into the human world, then the question is, who are we? Who are we? And she says that the disclosure of who somebody is implicit in both his words and deeds. So in the way you speak and in the way you act, you disclose who you are. And it's in doing so, you become part of the human world and thus become human, at least in this second sense. Action and speech thus reveal ourselves. They reveal ourselves as unique, appearing whos, as opposed to what's. First point, action and speech insert us into a humanly built world as whos, not what's. Second point, who we are is never in our control. Why is that? Why is who we are not in our control? Because when we insert ourselves into the world, we don't control how people will see us. Who we are becomes then a public fact, a public result of our interaction with others. In risking disclosure and entering the world, we enter a world with others. We're not lonely anymore. And we seek what she calls on 180 at the bottom of this first full paragraph, we seek the shining brightness which we once called glory and which is possible only in the public realm. But to find that means that we will be talked about by others. And thus, if you look at chapter 25, we enter what she calls the web of relationships and the enacted stories. We enter a world in which we exist primarily as acting and speaking beings. And in doing so, we enter a world that she calls on page 182 a world of interests. And she uses interests in its ancient Greek sense of inter esse, Inter meaning between, and esse meaning being, to be. It's this being in between, this between being that we enter, which is the world of the plurality of men who we now act and speak in such a way that this plurality of men takes notice of us and begins telling stories about us, sometimes documenting our history in documents, sometimes memorializing us in monuments, as she says on pages 183. And this interest, this in-between world, is just as much a part of the world as the world of tools and the world of things that are created by work and by artists. And so what we see is that the world now is split between the objective world of things and the web of human relationships, which is the world that goes on in between humans and things and between different humans. Because of that, when I act, I can't control my story. And thus, acting is always, as she says on 184, it never achieves its purpose. If I act with the purpose of ending capitalism, John, I have no idea what my act will achieve. And it's quite likely that it will achieve something quite different from what I set out to do. And so there's this kind of frustration in all actions, and yet we need to act. Why do we need to act? Why do we act, given the fact that we can't control our actions? Because, and this is to go back to the Dante quote that opened the chapter, right? There's a kind of, as she says, desire and delight in doing. Elsewhere in her work, she'll say that there is an inexplicable urge for all living things to reveal themselves, to appear and be taken notice of. She'll cite biologists about the beauty of butterflies or the beauty of flowers. And what she'll say is all living things want to appear, want to be talked about, want to be taken notice of, want to come into the world in some way. Bees and butterflies need to do it so they can reproduce. We need to do it partly to reproduce, but also because there's a desire for humans to become gods, right? To go back to glorify ourselves, to immortalize ourselves, to do things that others will say are great and lasting and deserve to be great and lasting. And so there's a kind of heroic nature to actions. And on 186, she'll say the hero of the story discloses, doesn't actually need heroic qualities, right? What it needs, and the only thing that a hero of a story needs, is courage. Now maybe courage is a heroic quality, I don't know. But what she says is the only thing you need to act is courage. Courage and even boldness is the very bottom of 186. The connotation of courage, which we now feel to be an indispensable quality of the hero, is in fact already present in a willingness to act and speak at all, to insert oneself into the world and begin a story of one's own. Which is why she'll go back on 36. She says courage is the first virtue of politics. And she is here, courage and even boldness are already present in leaving one's private hiding place and showing who one is, in disclosing and exposing oneself. You know, there's different levels of courage, but you being here, your picture's on this screen, asking a question, courage, inserting yourself in the world, wanting to be seen, risking it boldly. Which is why she'll say that drama and theater are the truly political arts, because they imitate and put on stage for others to see some act. And as an imitation of acting, they make acting visible and thus enact a kind of politics. All right, so let me stop there and see if there are questions on section 25.
I have a question.
Yeah, hi.
Hi. I can't help but feel that privacy and her notion of the private is still running through all of this, in the sense that biography and art are fundamentally inaccessible. Like thought occurs in private. That's what she said in the last section.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense of limitless interpretation to both biography, to action, to the social world, and to art, right? And this, so privacy is almost this epistemological limit that enables the entire field of interpretation.
Yeah.
And yet, at the same time, she's using this language of revealing and, opening yourself into the world. But this opening is always sort of incomplete. It's, sort of fundamentally incomplete. You can, how many more books are going to be published on Shakespeare? How many more books are going to be published on Winston Churchill, right? So there's this undercurrent of the private that is a shadow in many ways to everything that's being said here. But at the same time, what she's, so she's using the language of art to talk about action. And I think for me, theater is that ultimate metaphor, because it's sort of like, it's imitative, yet it's always constant. It's an aesthetic thing. So for me, it encapsulates that sort of dialectic, that hidden dialectic between what is revealed and what is always hidden.
I think that's perfectly right. One of the things that Arendt is pointing towards, and you're hitting it right on the head, Maurizio, is that to be human is to live both in private and in public. And she says this throughout the whole book, and in many of her books. There's a private part of life and there's a public part of life. If you want to put it in the context of her worry, it's that this new sphere that's emerged, the social sphere, the sphere of society, is making it impossible to have either a private life or a public life. Society threatens private life because society demands that we all share one opinion, that there's social good graces, and anyone who doesn't think that their diversity is good or whatever is not part of society. And so it invades the private sphere and says, if you raise your kids this way, we won't let you, we'll take them away from you, right? And it also invades the public insofar as what society says is what matters is, your family and your business and your wealth. All we want from the government is to keep order, right? Hobbes, so that we can pursue our own, what's important, which is our own private and social lives. And thus it delegitimates the public world. And it also says that since the public world depends upon equality, but only equality in governance, and so some people can excel and some not. So the social world demands equality throughout and demands thus that politics turn into administration to turn everything equal. From both these sides, the social invades the private and the public from her point of view and threatens them both. For her, humanity means having a part of yourself that is dark even to yourself. Psychoanalysis she was not a big fan of psychoanalysis, partly because she saw psychoanalysis as an attempt to pierce that darkness. But if you think of psychoanalysis in the way many psychoanalytic thinkers approach it today, psychoanalysis is an awareness of the fact that there are parts of yourself that are even dark to yourself and can never become fully unveiled. So for her, to be human is to be aware that we don't know ourselves in private, and also to be aware that in public we only know ourselves through the public human stories that are created about us, and we don't control ourselves either. There's a certain lack of control that is on both sides that she's holding up as part of being human, which is very much at odds with our ideas of science and technology and control today, and the desire for certainty, security, and safety. I don't know if you want to continue.
No, that's really great. Yeah, thanks.
Another question? I'll go on to the last section we're going to read today on the frailty of human affairs. And I know we're going over time-wise because we had some technological difficulties. I hope you can stay. I'll try and end it by 12:15. This last section is called the frailty of human affairs. And here she makes a very important point that will become that will now structure much of the rest of the chapter. So I hope you can stay with us. There are two ideas of action, right? One is arcane, or to begin or set in motion, and the other is protein, which is to finish or to bear the result. And what she wants to say here is that both are important, but it's the idea of the leader or the ruler who initiates the action. That is how we often imagine action. But we often think of the leader as the sovereign, the one who controls the action. And what she says is that's not right. The leader initiates, but there's a lack of control. Even the most powerful king, like Creon, can make an edict, but he can't control what Antigone is going to do. And so there is no leadership, or action is not the same thing as sovereignty. And beginning an action is always a risk, and we lose control of its end. If we take that seriously, there are three, what she calls frailties or dangers in all action. The first is that action is boundless. It's never a closed circle. So on 190 to 191, she says at the very, very bottom, limitations and boundaries exist within the realm of human affairs, but they never offer a framework that can reliably withstand the onslaught with which each new generation must insert itself. We have institutions, we have customs, we have rules, we have traditions, and they all exist, and they are limitations and boundaries. We have borders, but each new generation can overstep those borders, boundaries, limits, mores, customs, and traditions. And thus, no action can control things, can close the circle. It is boundless. And so we can think, I'm going to make a healthcare law so that people will be healthier, and it will help the poor. And yet we don't control how that's going to work out, or what's going to happen, or the technical difficulties that are going to emerge, etc. We can say, I'm going to take over the Ukraine and fight a war, and I may have some success for a while, but I have no ability to control and to bound my action. And a corollary of that is that my action is irreversible. Once I start it and unleash a process, I can't put the genie back in the bottle. This is why she'll say that moderation is praised by Aristotle as a virtue, because we have to act with the knowledge that we can't control our action. We need a certain humility. That's the first danger or frailty of action, that it's boundless. The second is that it's unpredictable. We simply cannot predict what our actions will bring. And since only after we die can we know how we will be remembered, action is not something we can control. And thus it's dangerous. And the third aspect of the danger of action that she'll talk about later in the book is that it's anonymous. In the end, most great things that happen are not the result of one person, right? I mean, we have the great man theory of action versus the time or the era theory of action. But most great things that happen because of the actions of millions of people, many of which we don't know about. And so action is anonymous, and thus we are not responsible for the impacts of our actions. People are talking a lot about microaggressions today, and it's a very complicated topic. I don't want to go into it fully, but part of the idea is that little things we do that we often don't know about lead to great pains or sufferings on other people. That's true in all areas of the world. What many people today want to say is we should hold the people who do those little actions responsible for their acts. And Arendt says you can't, because part of the nature of action is that it's unpredictable and it's anonymous and it's boundless, and people can't be responsible for their acts. So that's why the second to last chapter of this book is on forgiveness. You have to forgive people the consequences of their actions because they know not what they do. Given these frailties of action, that it's boundless, that it's unpredictable, and that it's anonymous, and that it's dangerous and risky and it takes courage, it's a miracle, Arendt says, that we would act at all. I mean, the rational thing to do is to crawl under your rock and do nothing, right? And that's what she calls the frailty of human affairs. It is purely rational, she says, to absent yourself from the humanly created world and live in private or in the social world and stay as far out of the public world as possible, to not get involved in politics, to not go into Occupy Wall Street, to not go into the Tea Party, to not get involved, right? And this, as you probably can gather, is for her a disaster, because she thinks that what makes us human is to act and speak in politics and to engage in politics and thus to try and build great and immortal things and take those risks. And so much of the rest of this chapter on action is an attempt to address solutions to the frailties of actions that allow people to engage in action and speech in public. Chapter 27 will be on the Greek solution, and it offers, in a sense, two solutions: the solution of Plato and Aristotle, which he thinks is the dangerous and wrong solution, and then the solution of the Greek polis, which she thinks is one important solution. And then she will, in chapters 28 through 30, talk more about solutions in the current, in the more modern world. And then in the last two sections on promising and forgiving, talk about promising and forgiving as essential responses to the frailty of action. So that's a bit of a prelude to what's coming, so that you are prepared as we go forward. But let me stop here and have 5 minutes to answer any questions that you might have on these three sections.
Roger, I have a question.
Hi.
I'm trying to write a paper about her understanding about law, and she starts to discuss the problem of the law and the limitations of law here. And I would like to hear your opinion about what I'm trying to write, because I'm trying to propose that we can kind of read.
You froze for a second. I don't know if that's me or you. Raphael, I'm losing you. All right. Well, maybe he'll come back. Are there any other questions?
This is John Bevan.
Hi, John.
Bevan, I'm just, I actually, wrote up a little, question which said, do you think that she would consider herself to be a libertarian in this age?
Would she consider herself to be a libertarian? The answer is I don't think she would label herself a libertarian. No. We have to think about what libertarians are. Libertarians offer as the highest value liberty, and that requires us to ask, what is liberty? If liberty is the right to be left alone, Arendt certainly believes in that to a large extent, but she doesn't think that defines the meaning or purpose of life. A libertarian, as I understand it today, thinks the best government is that who governs least, leaves us alone to our private and social lives, and that what matters most in life is what we do alone or in small groups. Arendt doesn't buy that at all. She thinks liberty is absolutely essential, but she thinks that what matters most in life is political action on a grand scale, and that we should aim to and we should seek to find those with whom we share common ideals and enact them and strive to reveal them and build them and make a world that is meaningful. So to the extent I understand libertarians as as retreating from the public world and wanting simply liberty to live in private, she's not a libertarian. She certainly would endorse many libertarian claims that we should have more liberty in private and less government intrusiveness. That's without a doubt. Is that
Thanks.
what? Does that make sense, John?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely makes sense. That's what I.
Okay. Raphael, I'm sorry. I know I was having trouble hearing you. Do you want to try your question again?
He's gone.
Oh, he's gone. Okay. Anyone else?
Okay.
All right. Oh, is there a question, Rita?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I do.
Okay. I have a question which is slightly off topic, Roger, but I think is very related to action in terms of praxis. And I know that Arendt talks a lot about Aristotle in terms of praxis, but I'm wondering why it is that she doesn't talk about Marx in terms of praxis. Or perhaps she does, and I just don't know.
What aspect of Marx do you have in mind? Just so I make sure I understand your question.
Okay, so I'm just thinking about a more kind of, the connection between theory and practice, how we act in the world in a way that perhaps these are just ideas off the top of my head, but I'm wondering whether it's because Arendt thinks it's too ideological in some ways and therefore is not open enough in terms of action. I'm just not sure.
Okay, now I understand your question, Rita. So I can at least offer an attempt at an answer. For Arendt, as brilliant as Marx is, and she thinks he is, he shares a fundamental flaw which goes through all of his work, which is that he is a scientist. He believes that politics and human action follow laws of historical materialism, and that these laws can not only, in a Hegelian sense, understand what's happened in the past, but can be used to help drive the future. That's standing Hegel on his head, right? That's the great Marxian move. And it's this, and exactly what we're reading about today is her view that action is unpredictable and it's free and spontaneous. And it's that unpredictability and spontaneity and humanity of action that Arendt thinks not only Marx doesn't understand, but wants to extinguish. Insofar as Marx, in a sense, subjugates the world to theory, he is totalitarian. By the way, she makes the same critique of Plato and Aristotle on page 195 in the next chapter that you're going to read on the Greek solution. And she'll make the critique of both Plato and Aristotle and Marx in her unpublished manuscript on the Promise of Politics, which is published as a book, The Promise of Politics, in which she argues that philosophers are anti-political insofar as they elevate truth over politics, or truth over action, truth over opinion. And for her, Plato and Aristotle make the same mistake insofar as they try and say that politics should be governed by a philosopher king or by truth, as opposed to by free debate, politics, action, and a chaos. And in the end, Arendt will always prefer a certain amount of chaos over philosophical and theoretical order.
Okay. It's just so fascinating because it's, most people, I think, who read Marx at all, see him as a political thinker, right? In many ways, right? Or an economic thinker, but this notion that actually he's not political enough for Arendt.
That's right. In fact, her argument is that he is a political philosopher, which for her is the most dangerous thing in the world, because he brings philosophy into politics. In fact, that's his argument, is that we have to bring philosophy into politics and thus subordinate politics to philosophy. And that is what she thinks Plato and Aristotle began and is very dangerous.
Okay. Thank you.
Raphael, I see you're back. I don't know if you want to try your question again or not. But if you
wouldn't mind,
I'm happy to. If people want to leave, you can. I understand, but as long as Raphael wants to ask it, I'm happy to answer it or try.
Yeah, just to be brief. So I'm trying to understand, make her understanding of law closer to her understanding on education, her concept of amor mundi, the idea that you have to be responsible enough about the world. And I would like to hear your thoughts, because she has a not that she has an interesting understanding about law, kind of takes some different how can I say that?
All right, there's enough there that I can answer. I can try this, and
Please.
and then we can talk about it offline if you want. So, on the most basic level, law for Arendt is pre-political. Law is the fences, the boundaries, laws create the space and the rules in which people can then enter into politics and discussion. And so the lawgiver and the builder of the polis creates the public space in which people can then enter into and do politics. The laws are pre-political. To that extent, well, even though laws are made, they are part and parcel of the world of things and objects into which we are born. And while it is certainly possible, and it's in fact a truism, that over long periods of time, law will change, we are all born into a certain world with certain laws, certain cultures, certain rules, certain truths. And what she says, her idea of amor mundi, is that we must, first of all, as children, and this is the responsibility of parents and of teachers, we must first of all be taught to love our world, right? The first principle of education is that education is conservative, not in a political sense, but in the sense that education teaches children, you are born into this world at this time, and here's how things are. And they're good. That doesn't mean there's not problems. That doesn't mean there's not injustice. But you have to learn to love the world with all of its problems in it. That's the first side of education. The second side of education is that if you are taught to love the world as it is, one thing you are taught about the world as it is that the world as it is always changes, and that it never is static. And so, once you have learned the world as it is and matured to the point where you have a grasp of it, you then enter the world as an adult who can try and act and change it. Now, your actions will never achieve what you want them to achieve, or unlikely, but you can and thus you should be very careful about risking actions to change the world. And you should only do so if you think the world is deeply in need of being changed. But if you think it is, and there are always times in which it is, you should risk action. And thus you should try and change not only institutions, but laws, and even maybe the whole idea of law, if in some situation. But so, I mean, there's a lot of ways I could answer your question, but there's one connection between law and amor mundi that I think at least can get us started. Okay.
Thank you.
Again, I want to apologize for the technological problems, and I wish I had seen them earlier. I'm glad we got to finish. We will continue in July. I have to check the date because I don't want to do it July 4th weekend, but we'll send out a time to meet early in July, and I look forward to talking to you all then. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.